When Clara Hartwell stepped off the train in 1867 Nebraska with nothing but a satchel and a broken heart, she believed her life was overcast aside by a husband who chose a younger bride and left her with nowhere to turn. But sometimes the greatest betrayals lead us to discover territories of the heart we never knew existed. What happens when a woman who thought she was worthless finds a man who sees her true worth? The train's whistle screamed across the empty Nebraska prairie like a wounded animal crying for help. Clara Hartwell pressed her face against the dirty window, watching endless grass dance in the wind as the year 1867 rolled beneath iron wheels. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Millbrook Station, end of the line." Clara's hands shook as she gathered her small leather bag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that worn satchel: 2 dresses, a brush, and the divorce papers that had torn her life apart just 3 days ago. Other passengers rushed past her, eager to reach their destinations. But Clara had no destination, no family waiting, no home to return to. Edmund had made sure of that when he handed her the train ticket and pointed toward the door. "You're free now," he had said, not looking at her face. "Free to find someone who wants a barren wife." The word still stung like a slap across her cheek. 7 years of marriage, and she had never been able to give Edmund the son he wanted. 7 years of trying, hoping, praying, only to watch him bring home a girl barely out of childhood who was already carrying his baby. Clara stepped onto the wooden platform as the train pulled away, black smoke disappearing into the blue sky. The sound of wheels on tracks grew fainter until only wind remained. She stood alone on the platform, clutching her bag like a shield against the world. Millbrook Station wasn't much to look at. A small wooden building with peeling paint sat next to the tracks. Beyond it, she could see a few houses scattered across the valley like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and mysterious under the afternoon sun. A dog barked somewhere in town. A baby cried from one of the houses. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. Clara had never felt less normal in her entire existence. She walked to the edge of the platform and sat down, her legs dangling over the side like a child's. The wood was warm from the sun, and she could smell wildflowers growing nearby. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like the loneliest place on earth. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered to the grass. The wind rustled through the prairie, but it didn't have any answers. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. The few coins in her pocket wouldn't buy much, maybe enough for one meal, but then what? She had no skills that would help her survive out here. Back in Philadelphia, she had been a wife. She had planned dinner parties and arranged flowers and made polite conversation with other wives. None of that mattered now. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind currents with graceful ease. Clara envied its freedom. It knew where it was going and how to get there. It didn't need anyone else to survive. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the clouds orange and pink. Soon it would be dark, and she would still be sitting on this platform with nowhere to go. The thought made her chest tight with fear. She opened her bag and pulled out the divorce papers, reading Edmund's neat handwriting once more. "Irreconcilable differences," it said. That was a polite way of saying she had failed as a woman, failed as a wife, failed at the one thing society expected her to do well. A tear dropped onto the paper, smearing the ink slightly. She quickly folded it back up and stuffed it into her bag. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't give her a home or a purpose or a reason to keep going. But as she sat there watching the sky change colors, something stirred inside her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope seemed too big and bright for this moment. It was smaller than that. More like curiosity. She had never been alone before, never had to make decisions without asking someone else first. Maybe there was something scary but also exciting about that. The sound of wagon wheels on dirt made her look up. Someone was coming down the road toward the station. Clara's heart started beating faster again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was the first flutter of possibility. The wagon rounded the bend, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. The man driving it looked like he had been carved from the same tough wood as the platform she sat on. His brown hair was longer than fashionable men wore back east, and his clothes were practical rather than pretty. But it was his eyes that made her stare, gray like storm clouds, but somehow warm at the same time. He pulled the horses to a stop near the platform and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, miss. You look like you might be waiting for something." Clara's voice stuck in her throat for a moment. She hadn't spoken to a stranger in years without Edmund standing beside her, telling her what to say. I'm not sure what I'm waiting for." The man studied her face with the careful attention of someone who is used to reading the weather in clouds and the mood of animals in their movements. He seemed to see something there that made him nod slowly. "Well, waiting's easier when you're not doing it alone," he said, climbing down from the wagon with a slight limp. Clara noticed how he favored his left leg, but he moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to work around his limitations. "I'm James McKenna," he said, extending a work-roughened hand. "And you are?" "Clara," she replied, then hesitated. Was she still Clara Hartwell? The divorce papers said she was free to use her maiden name again, but that felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Clara Hartwell. James nodded as if her name was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Pleased to meet you, Clara Hartwell. Mind if I ask what brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" The question was asked gently, without the pushiness she was used to from men who felt entitled to her story. She found herself wanting to answer honestly, which surprised her. "My husband. My former husband. He didn't want me anymore." The words came out easier than she had expected. "He gave me a train ticket and told me to find a new life." James's jaw tightened slightly, and she saw his hands clench into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. "Man who doesn't know what he's got deserves to lose it," he said quietly. "Question is, what do you want to do now?" Clara blinked at him. No one had asked her what she wanted in so long. She had almost forgotten she was allowed to want things. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had to decide for myself before." "Well then," James said, loading her small bag into his wagon without asking permission, "maybe it's time you learned. I'm headed to the Brennan Ranch about 10 miles from here. Moira Brennan's got more work than she can handle, and more opinions than any 3 people should have. She might have some ideas about what a person like you could do with a fresh start." Clara hesitated. Getting into a wagon with a stranger went against everything she had been taught about proper behavior. But proper behavior had led her to this empty platform with no money and no prospects. Maybe it was time to try improper behavior and see where it led. "I don't have any money to pay for the ride," she said honestly. James was already climbing back onto the wagon seat. "Did I ask for money? Come on, the sun's getting low and Moira gets cranky when people are late for supper." Clara found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. There was something about James McKenna that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. Not the suffocating safety of being protected, but the real safety of being seen and accepted. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him, her heart beating fast with nervousness and something that might have been excitement. The horses snorted and stamped, eager to be moving again. "Hold on tight," James said, clicking his tongue at the horses. "These girls like to run when they're headed home." As the wagon rolled away from Millbrook Station, Clara turned to look back at the platform where she had been sitting just minutes before. It already looked smaller and less important, like something from someone else's life. The prairie stretched out around them in all directions, golden grass waving in the evening breeze. It was bigger and wilder than anything she had ever seen. Instead of feeling scared by all that open space, Clara felt something expanding in her chest. Room to breathe. Room to become someone new. "What's the Brennan Ranch like?" she asked James as they bounced along the dirt road. "It's a place where hard work matters more than where you came from," James replied. "Moira lost her husband 2 years back, but she's kept the ranch running through sheer stubbornness and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She's always looking for people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." Clara looked down at her soft, pale hands. They had never done real work, just arranged flowers and poured tea and folded Edmund's clothes. "I'm not sure I know how to do anything useful." James glanced at her sideways, and she caught the hint of a smile on his weather-beaten face. "Everybody's got to start somewhere, Clara Hartwell." The question isn't whether you know how to do something. The question is whether you're willing to learn. As they crested a hill, Clara saw lights twinkling in the distance. The Brennan Ranch. Her new beginning, whatever that might look like. For the first time since Edmund had handed her those divorce papers, she felt something other than fear about the future. She felt curious about who she might become. The rooster's crows split the morning air like an axe through wood, jolting Clara awake before Dawn had even thought about painting the sky. 6 weeks at the Brennan Ranch, and she still wasn't used to waking up when the world was dark and cold. "Clara! Those chickens won't feed themselves!" Moira's voice carried from the kitchen below, sharp as a whip crack, but somehow affectionate too. The older woman had taken Clara in without asking too many questions, just put her to work and watched to see what she was made of. Clara rolled out of the narrow bed in the room above the kitchen, her muscles aching in places she never knew existed. Her hands, once soft as rose petals, now bore calluses from hauling water buckets and mending fence posts. The blisters had healed into tough skin that could grip an axe handle without wincing. She dressed quickly in the practical wool dress Moira had given her, brown as prairie dirt and twice as sturdy as anything from her old wardrobe. The silk gowns Edmund had bought her hung useless in a trunk under her bed. Pretty things for a pretty life that had turned out to be as fragile as soap bubbles. Outside, the ranch yard buzzed with morning activity. Ranch hands led horses to the watering trough, while others loaded supplies onto wagons. The air smelled of hay and leather, and the kind of honest sweat that came from real work. Clara scattered grain for the chickens, smiling as they flapped and squawked around her feet. These birds didn't care that she had been a failure as a wife. They just wanted their breakfast, and laid eggs regardless of her past mistakes. "You're getting faster at that." James appeared beside the chicken coop, leading his horse toward the barn. Over the past weeks, their conversations had grown longer and more comfortable. He never pushed her to talk about her marriage, but he listened when she chose to share pieces of her story. "Moira says I might actually be useful someday," Clara replied, brushing grain dust from her apron. "High praise from her." James chuckled, adjusting the saddle on his horse. "Moira doesn't waste words on people she doesn't think can improve. When she took me on 2 years ago, she barely spoke to me for a month. Just pointed at things that needed doing and watched to see if I'd figure it out." "What brought you here?" Clara found herself asking. In all their talks, James had shared very little about his own past. She knew he had been a soldier. The limp and the way he sometimes stared at distant horizons told that story, but the details remained locked away. James was quiet for a moment, running his hand along his horse's neck. "War ended, and I needed somewhere to heal, body, and other things. Moira's good at giving people space to put themselves back together." Before Clara could ask more, Moira's voice boomed across the yard. "James, that fence in the south pasture won't mend itself. And Clara, I need you in the kitchen. We've got accounting to do." Clara hurried inside, where Moira had spread ledger books across the kitchen table like battle plans. Numbers filled page after page, cattle sales, supply costs, wages for the ranch hands. It looked overwhelming, but Clara had always been good with figures. Edmund had never let her handle their household accounts, saying it wasn't a wife's place. Here, Moira handed her a pencil and pointed at columns that didn't add up right. "See if you can make sense of this mess," Moira said, pouring coffee that could strip paint. "My Patrick always handled the books, and I've been guessing my way through them since he passed." Clara bent over the ledgers, her mind clicking through the numbers like clockwork. She found mistakes within minutes, payments recorded twice, expenses listed in the wrong columns, simple arithmetic errors that had been building for months. "Here," she said, showing Moira the problems. "And here. If we move these numbers to the right places, you're actually making more profit than you thought." Moira peered over Clara's shoulder, following her finger as she explained each correction. "Well, I'll be hanged," the older woman muttered. "Patrick always said I was too stubborn to be stupid, but I was starting to wonder." They worked through the morning, Clara reorganizing the books, while Moira shared stories about running the ranch. Patrick had been the dreamer, Moira explained, always planning bigger herds and better pastures. She was the practical one, making sure they had enough hay for winter and money for emergencies. What happens when dreamers die? Clara asked quietly, thinking of her own shattered dreams. Moira looked up from the ledger, her gray eyes steady. Practical people learn to dream too, or they find new dreamers to believe in. The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara wasn't ready to examine too closely. Outside, she could hear James calling orders to the ranch hands, his voice carrying confidence and authority she was beginning to recognize. As afternoon approached, Clara walked to the pasture to watch James work with a young horse that had never worn a saddle. The animal pranced and shied away from the leather, fear making its eyes roll white. "Easy now," James murmured, moving slowly and keeping his voice calm. "Nobody's going to hurt you, just getting you used to new things." Clara leaned against the fence, fascinated by his patience. Edmund had always been quick to anger when things didn't go his way. He would have forced the issue, used a whip or harsh words to bend the horse to his will. James seemed to understand that some things couldn't be rushed or bullied into submission. The horse finally allowed James to place the saddle on its back, though it still danced nervously under the unfamiliar weight. "That'll do for today," James said, removing the saddle and turning the horse loose in the pasture. "How do you know when to push and when to wait?" Clara asked as he approached the fence. James considered the question while he coiled his rope. "Experience, mostly, and watching for signs. When something's been hurt before, you can't just pretend the hurt never happened. You have to earn trust, one small step at a time." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, wondering if he was talking about horses or something else entirely. What if the hurt was too deep? What if it can't be fixed? "Everything can heal," James said softly, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "Just depends on whether you're willing to try again." The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities Clara didn't dare name. Then the dinner bell rang from the house, breaking the spell and sending them both toward practical concerns like food and evening chores. But as Clara helped Moira serve supper to the ranch hands, she found herself stealing glances at James across the crowded kitchen. Something was growing between them, fragile as a seedling but surprisingly strong. She just wasn't sure she was brave enough to tend it. Thunder crashed overhead like the world was splitting apart, and Clara bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rain hammered the roof with fists of water, and lightning turned her small room white as bleached bones. But it wasn't the storm that had torn her from sleep. It was the letter lying on her nightstand. The letter that had arrived 3 days ago with Edmund's familiar handwriting crawling across expensive paper like black spiders. The letter she had read once and then shoved into a drawer, hoping it would disappear if she ignored it long enough. Another crack of thunder sent her stumbling to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see lights moving in the barn where the ranch hands were checking on the horses. The storm had everyone awake, it seemed. Clara lit her oil lamp with shaking fingers and pulled the letter from the drawer. Edmund's words seemed to glow in the flickering light. "Our marriage was never legally ended due to mistakes in the paperwork. You remain my wife under the law and must return immediately. I will arrive to collect you within the week." The paper crumpled in her fist as rage and terror fought for control of her thoughts. After 2 months of building a new life, of discovering muscles she didn't know she had, and thoughts Edmund had never allowed her to think, he wanted to drag her back into the cage she had escaped. Lightning illuminated the yard again, and Clara saw a figure running through the rain toward the house. James. Even in the storm, she recognized his uneven gait and the determined set of his shoulders. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried downstairs as he pounded on the kitchen door. When she opened it, he stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and breathing hard. "The creek's rising fast," he gasped, water streaming from his hair. "Could flood the south pasture where we moved the cattle yesterday. We need to get them to higher ground before morning." "In this storm?" Clara asked, pulling towels from the cupboard. "It's dangerous enough for people, let alone animals." "More dangerous to leave them where they are," James replied, accepting the towel gratefully. "If that water keeps rising, we could lose half the herd." Moira appeared at the top of the stairs, fully dressed despite the early hour. "I heard," she called down. "Wake the hands. We'll need every person we can get." Clara found herself moving without thinking, pulling on her boots and reaching for her rain slicker. "I'm coming too." "No," James said firmly. "This isn't work for someone who's never done it before. Cattle get stupid in storms, and they're dangerous when they're scared." "I'm not helpless," Clara shot back, surprised by the fire in her own voice. "I've been here 2 months. I can hold a rope and follow orders." James opened his mouth to argue, but Moira's voice cut through the discussion. "She comes. We need bodies more than we need protection." The next few hours blurred into a nightmare of rain and mud and bellowing cattle. Clara had never been so cold, so wet, or so terrified in her entire life. The herd milled around in confusion, their eyes rolling white in the lightning flashes. Several times, she found herself pressed against James's back as he used his horse to turn the animals toward higher ground. The work was brutal and dangerous. Twice, cattle broke from the group and had to be chased through the darkness. Once, Clara's horse stumbled in the mud, and she barely kept her seat as the animal scrambled for footing. But slowly, painfully, they moved the entire herd to safety on a hill above the floodplain. As dawn broke gray and exhausted over the ranch, Clara found herself standing in the barn beside James, both of them covered in mud from head to toe. The rain had finally stopped, and the immediate danger was over, but the effort had left everyone drained. "You did good out there," James said quietly, not looking at her as he hung up his wet gear. Lot of experienced hands couldn't have kept up. Clara felt a warm glow of pride that had nothing to do with pleasing someone else and everything to do with proving something to herself. "I was scared the whole time. Being scared and doing it anyway. That's what courage looks like," James replied. He turned to face her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Clara, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks, but maybe there aren't any right words for this." Before he could continue, the barn door burst open and Moira strode in, her face grim. "Clara, you need to see this." She held out a telegram, and Clara's hands went numb as she read the message. "Arriving Tuesday, stop legal papers in order, stop prepare for departure, stop. Edmund Hartwell." "Today's Monday," Moira said unnecessarily. "He'll be here tomorrow." The warm glow of accomplishment died in Clara's chest, replaced by the familiar cold weight of fear. She had been fooling herself, thinking she could build a new life out here. Edmund had the law on his side, and the law said she belonged to him whether she wanted to or not. "What are you going to do?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. Clara looked around the barn that had become more of a home than the fancy house in Philadelphia had ever been. She thought about the ledgers upstairs where her neat handwriting was bringing order to chaos. She thought about the chickens that trusted her to feed them, and the way Moira nodded approval when she did something right. She thought about the way James looked at her, not like a possession or a disappointment, but like a person with value all her own. "I don't know," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "I don't know if I have a choice." But even as she said it, something rebellious stirred in her chest. The same something that had driven her to demand a place in the cattle drive despite the danger. The same something that had learned to swing an axe and balance books and stand on her own 2 feet. Edmund might have the law on his side, but Clara was no longer the broken woman who had stepped off that train 2 months ago. She had found muscles and opinions and the beginning of a voice that belonged to no one but herself. The question was whether that would be enough when he arrived to claim what he thought was his. The black carriage rolled into the ranch yard like a funeral procession, pulled by 2 perfectly matched horses that had never known a day of real work. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Edmund stepped down, brushing dust from his expensive coat with the same disgust he had once shown when touching her. Behind him came 2 men in city suits, his lawyer and another man whose cold eyes swept the ranch like he was counting its worth in dollars. Edmund had brought witnesses to his victory, Clara realized. People who would make sure she couldn't slip away again. "Well," Moira said dryly, standing beside Clara at the window, "your husband certainly knows how to make an entrance. Looks like he's here to buy the place, not collect a wife." James appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face carved from stone but his hands clenched into fists. "I could ride to town, get the sheriff. Maybe there's something he can do." "Sheriff Patterson owes money to half the county," Moira replied. "He's not going to stand up to lawyers from back east, especially not for a divorced woman." "I'm not divorced," Clara said quietly, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "That's the problem. According to Edmund's lawyer, the papers were filed wrong. Technically, I'm still his wife." The knock on the front door came sharp and demanding. 3 quick raps that sounded like a judge's gavel falling. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk toward the sound. Running would only make things worse. She opened the door to find Edmund standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking every inch the respectable businessman. Up close, she could see new lines around his eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. Becoming a father had aged him, or maybe it was the guilt of what he had done to her. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as false, "you look different." She knew what he meant. The soft woman who had stepped off the train 2 months ago was gone. Sun and hard work had tanned her skin and put muscle on her frame. Her hair hung in a simple braid instead of elaborate curls, and her dress was practical rather than pretty. "Edmund," she replied, not moving from the doorway, "you should have sent word you were coming. We could have prepared a proper welcome." His smile was thin as paper. "I did send word. A telegram. Surely you received it?" Behind Clara, she could feel James and Moira watching from the kitchen. Their presence gave her strength, reminding her that she wasn't alone this time. She had people who cared about her well-being rather than her usefulness. "I got your message," Clara said. "I also got the clear impression that you think I belong to you. That's where you're mistaken." Edmund's lawyer stepped forward, a thin man with sharp features and sharper eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm afraid your feelings on the matter are irrelevant. The law is quite clear about a wife's obligations to her husband. The law is also clear about a husband's obligations to his wife," James said, moving to stand behind Clara. "Abandonment is grounds for divorce in most states, including this one." The lawyer smiled without warmth. "Perhaps, but that divorce was never properly filed. Mr. Hartwell's marriage remains intact, making any relationships his wife may have formed here both improper and illegal." Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, but not from shame, from anger. These men were talking about her like she was a piece of property being disputed in court. Like her thoughts and feelings and choices meant nothing at all. "I want to speak with my wife privately," Edmund said, his tone suggesting he expected immediate compliance. "We have matters to discuss. Anything you have to say to me can be said here," Clara replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "These people are my friends. They have a right to hear what kind of man you really are." Edmund's calm mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. "Clara, you're making a scene. This isn't like you." "Maybe you never knew who I really was," she shot back. "Maybe you were too busy looking for someone who would disappear into your shadow to notice I had opinions of my own." From Edmund's perspective, this reunion was going all wrong. He had expected to find Clara broken and grateful, ready to return to the safety of being his wife. Instead, he found a woman who looked him in the eye and spoke her mind. A woman who had clearly found her backbone somewhere in this God-forsaken wilderness. The younger man who stood behind her was obviously the problem. Edmund could see the way he watched Clara, could read the protective anger in his stance. This James McKenna was the reason his wife had grown defiant. Remove him from the equation, and Clara would remember her place. "Mr. McKenna, isn't it?" Edmund said, turning his attention to James. "I understand you've been helpful to my wife during her temporary confusion. I'm prepared to compensate you for your trouble." He pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. "Say $200 for your time and discretion? More than generous for a ranch hand, I think." The insult hit its target. James's jaw tightened, and Clara saw his hands curl into fists. But when he spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Hartwell, and neither is your wife." "My wife is not for sale because she already belongs to me," Edmund replied smoothly, "just as this conversation belongs in private. Clara, get your things. We leave within the hour." No. The word came out stronger than Clara had intended, ringing across the porch like a bell. I won't go with you, Edmund. Not now. Not ever. Edmund's lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps you don't understand the seriousness of your situation. Your husband has been more than patient, but his tolerance has limits. If you refuse to honor your marriage vows, he can have you declared mentally incompetent and committed to an institution for treatment. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how truly trapped she was. In 1867, a woman had no legal standing apart from her husband. If Edmund wanted to lock her away, he probably could. But as the fear tried to crush her, Clara remembered the feeling of riding through the storm to save the cattle, the satisfaction of balancing Moira's books, the way James looked at her like she was strong enough to handle whatever came her way. Then I guess we'll have to prove I'm not incompetent, she said, lifting her chin. I've been managing the accounts for this ranch. I can read and write and do mathematics. I've learned to handle livestock and mend fences. Plenty of witnesses here can testify that I'm perfectly sane. Edmund's composure cracked completely. Enough! Clara, stop this nonsense immediately. You're my wife, and you will come home with me today. Why? Clara demanded. So you can ignore me while you play happy family with your new bride? So you can remind me daily that I failed to give you children? What kind of life is that, Edmund? It's the life you chose when you married me, he snapped. For better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do us part. Those vows meant something, Clara. They meant something to me too, she replied. Right up until you threw them away for a younger woman. You broke our marriage, Edmund. I'm just refusing to pretend the pieces can be put back together. The standoff stretched between them, heavy with years of resentment and broken promises. Around them, the ranch continued its daily business, horses nickering in the pasture, chickens pecking in the yard, the normal sounds of a life Clara had built from nothing. A life she was not willing to give up without a fight. There is another option, James said quietly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Everyone on the porch turned to stare at him, and Clara felt her heart stop beating for a moment. Clara could marry someone else. Edmund's face turned purple with rage. She's already married. To me. A marriage that was supposedly dissolved. James continued, his voice calm despite the storm brewing in his gray eyes. If the paperwork was wrong before, maybe it can be done right this time, with proper legal representation. The lawyer shook his head smugly. Impossible. Mrs. Hartwell cannot marry another man while her current marriage exists. That would be bigamy, a serious crime. But Moira stepped forward, a gleam in her sharp eyes that Clara had learned to recognize. The older woman was planning something. What if the first marriage was never legal to begin with? What are you talking about? Edmund demanded. Moira smiled like a cat who had caught a particularly fat mouse. Clara, dear, how old were you when you married this man? 17, Clara replied, confused about where this was leading. We married right after my birthday. And did your parents give permission for the marriage? Clara's mind raced back to her wedding day. Her father had been away on business, and her mother had been too sick to attend. She remembered signing papers, but in all the excitement and nerves, she hadn't paid attention to the details. I'm not sure. My father wasn't there, and mother was ill. I signed whatever the minister put in front of me. Moira's smile grew wider. In Pennsylvania, a girl under 18 needs parental consent to marry. Without that signature, the marriage might not be legal at all. Edmund's lawyer looked uncomfortable for the first time since arriving. That's a very technical point, and difficult to prove after so many years. But not impossible, James said, hope creeping into his voice. If Clara's parents never signed the papers, then she's been a free woman all along. Clara felt dizzy with the possibility. Could it really be that simple? Could the marriage that had trapped her for 7 years turn out to be nothing more than a mistake on paper? Edmund's face had gone from purple to white. This is ridiculous. Clara is my wife in every way that matters. We lived together as husband and wife for 7 years. We shared a bed, a home, A life together. A life you threw away when you found someone younger, Clara said, her voice growing stronger with each word. A life you ended when you handed me divorce papers and a train ticket. I was angry, Edmund shouted, his careful composure finally cracking completely. You couldn't give me children. Do you know what that feels like for a man? To be married to a woman who can't fulfill her most basic purpose? The words hit Clara like physical blows, reopening wounds she thought had healed. For a moment, she was 17 again, standing at the altar promising to love and honor a man who would spend the next 7 years making her feel worthless. But then James stepped closer, his presence solid and warm behind her. A woman's purpose isn't determined by what she can give a man, he said, his voice deadly quiet. It's determined by who she chooses to be. And who are you to speak about my wife? Edmund snarled. I'm the man who sees her worth, James replied without flinching. I'm the man who watches her work harder than most men I know and never complain. I'm the man who's seen her face down scared cattle in a thunderstorm and balance books that would confuse a banker. He paused, his eyes meeting Clara's. I'm the man who loves her for exactly who she is, not for what she might give him. The words hung in the air like a promise and a challenge combined. Clara felt her heart swell with something she had never experienced before, the certainty that she was valued not for what she could provide, but for who she truly was. Edmund looked between them, seeing something in their faces that made his own expression turn ugly. You think you love her? You don't even know her. She's cold in bed and boring at dinner parties. She cries when you raise your voice and flinches when you touch her. What kind of wife is that for a real man? The kind who was married to the wrong person, Clara said, finding her voice again. The kind who never had a chance to discover who she really was, because she was too busy trying to be what you wanted. She turned to James, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. You said there was another option. What did you have in mind? James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring made of braided silver wire. It was simple and rough compared to the expensive bands Edmund had bought her, but it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. I made this last week, James said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been carrying it around, waiting for the right moment to ask you something. Clara Hartwell, will you marry me? Not because you have to, but because you want to, because we choose each other. Edmund's lawyer sputtered protests about legality and proper procedure, but Clara barely heard him. All her attention was focused on James's storm-gray eyes and the promise she saw there. A promise of partnership instead of ownership, of respect instead of possession. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, James McKenna, I choose you. I choose this life. I choose myself. As James slipped the simple ring onto her finger, Clara felt something inside her chest that had been locked away for years finally break free. It was her own voice, her own choices, her own future spreading out before her like the endless Nebraska prairie. Edmund was shouting something about legal challenges and proper procedures, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Clara was too busy discovering what it felt like to be truly free. For the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. The gunshot cracked through the morning air like a branch breaking, and Clara's coffee cup shattered on the kitchen floor. Through the window, she saw Edmund's lawyer holding a smoking pistol pointed at the sky, his face twisted with fury. That's enough, the lawyer shouted, his city manners finally stripped away to reveal something uglier underneath. Mr. Hartwell has been more than patient with this charade. Mrs. Hartwell, you will come with us now, or we'll take you by force. James stepped in front of Clara, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Around the ranch yard, other hands began to emerge from the barn and bunkhouse, drawn by the sound of trouble. But Edmund's second man had produced a rifle from their carriage, and the situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Nobody needs to get hurt here, James said carefully, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. This is a legal matter, not a range war. Legal matters require cooperation, Edmund snapped, his composure completely gone now. My wife has forgotten her place, but I'm prepared to remind her. Clara felt anger flare in her chest, burning away the last traces of fear. She pushed past James, ignoring his attempt to keep her behind him. My place? You mean the place where I cleaned your house and warmed your bed and smiled at your friends while you complained about my failures? You took vows, Edmund roared, before God and witnesses. Those meant something. They meant something to me too, Clara shot back, her voice carrying across the yard. Right up until you decided they didn't apply to you. Tell me, Edmund, what vows did you take to your new bride while you were still married to me? The question hit home. Edmund's face went red, then white, as he realized his own hypocrisy was on display for everyone to see. His lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear, but Edmund shook him off. This ends now, Edmund declared, pulling out a set of legal papers. I have a court order here requiring any local authority to assist in returning my wife to Pennsylvania. Sheriff Patterson will enforce this order, or he'll answer to the territorial governor. Moira stepped forward, her weathered face calm despite the chaos around her. Sheriff Patterson's not here. He rode to Cheyenne yesterday on business. Won't be back for a week. Then we'll wait, the lawyer said coldly. And while we wait, Mrs. Hartwell will remain in our custody to prevent any further misunderstandings. Like hell she will, James growled, and Clara could see the soldier in him rising to the surface. The careful, patient man who trained horses was being replaced by someone who had fought in battles and knew how to handle desperate situations. But Clara had learned something about herself over the past months. She didn't need James to fight her battles for her. She was perfectly capable of standing up for herself. I have a proposal, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. A compromise that even your legal mind should appreciate. Edmund's lawyer raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Give me 3 days, Clara continued. 3 days to prove that my original marriage was invalid due to lack of parental consent. If I can produce the documentation, you'll drop all claims and leave us in peace. If I can't, I'll come with you voluntarily. Absolutely not, Edmund started, but his lawyer held up a hand. What guarantee do we have that you won't simply disappear during these 3 days? Clara thought quickly. She needed something valuable enough to ensure their cooperation, but not so precious that losing it would destroy her. Then inspiration struck. I'll give you my word as collateral, she said. But more than that, I'll give you something you can understand. Money. Moira, what's the ranch worth? The older woman looked surprised, but played along. $8,000, give or take, including the cattle and equipment. Fine, Clara said, meeting the lawyer's greedy eyes. If I can't prove my case in 3 days, you can have the ranch as compensation for your trouble. Plus, I'll return to Edmund without any further legal challenges. James grabbed her arm. Clara, you can't bet the ranch. It's not yours to wager. Actually, Moira said quietly, it is. Patrick left it to me, and I can leave it to whoever I choose. If Clara wants to risk it to win her freedom, that's her right. The lawyer's eyes gleamed at the prospect of such a valuable prize. Even Edmund looked interested despite his anger. $8,000 was more than most men made in 5 years. 3 days, the lawyer agreed. But if you fail to produce convincing evidence, the ranch becomes our property, and you return to Pennsylvania immediately. No appeals, no further delays. Agreed, Clara said, extending her hand to shake on the deal. But the same terms apply if I win. You leave immediately and never contact me again. As they shook hands, Clara felt the weight of what she had just done. She had bet everything, not just her own future, but Moira's livelihood and James's home, on a legal technicality that might not even exist. But she had also bought herself time, and time was what she needed most. 3 days to find proof that her marriage to Edmund had never been legal. 3 days to discover if the life she had built here was worth fighting for. As Edmund and his men retreated to set up camp near the creek, Clara turned to find James and Moira staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Well, Moira said finally, I always said you had backbone. I just didn't know you had enough to bet the whole spread on it. Are you angry? Clara asked, suddenly realizing the enormity of what she had risked with other people's property. Angry? Moira chuckled. Honey, I haven't been this excited since Patrick decided to buy our first bull with money we didn't have. Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards." James was quieter, his storm-gray eyes serious as he studied Clara's face. "Do you really think you can prove the marriage was invalid?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I know I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." She looked around the ranch yard, at the place that had become more of a home than any house Edmund had ever provided. At the chickens that trusted her to feed them, and the ledgers that made sense under her careful attention. At the people who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "This is my life now," she said firmly. "My choice, my future, my risk to take. In 3 days, we'll know if I'm brave enough to keep it." The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its evening song, wild and free and unafraid of the darkness. Clara McKenna, she liked the sound of that name, stood on her porch and howled back. The courthouse in Millbrook looked like it had been built by someone who believed justice should be intimidating. Clara climbed the wooden steps at dawn, her boots echoing in the empty hall as she headed for the records office with James beside her and determination burning in her chest. 2 days had already passed in a blur of frantic searching. They had torn through every document Moira could find, written letters to Clara's childhood church, and even sent a telegram to the cemetery where her parents were buried. But so far, they had found nothing that could prove her marriage to Edmund was invalid. "Last chance," James said quietly as Clara pulled out the key the clerk had given her. "If the marriage records aren't here, we're out of options." Clara's hands shook slightly as she unlocked the heavy door. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with ledgers and files that held the legal history of the territory. Birth certificates, death records, marriage licenses, and divorce papers. All the official moments that marked the passage of human lives. 1,860, Clara murmured, running her finger along the spines of the marriage record books. "That's what we need." They found the right volume and carried it to a desk by the window where the morning light was strongest. Clara's wedding had taken place in June, and she flipped through pages of careful handwriting until she found the right date. "Here," she said, her heart sinking as she read the familiar details. James Edmund Hartwell and Clara Elizabeth Morrison, married June 15th, 1860, witnessed by. She stopped, her eyes widening as she read the signature line. "What is it?" James asked, leaning closer to read over her shoulder. "The witness signature," Clara whispered. "It says Robert Morrison, father of the bride. But my father wasn't there. He was in Chicago on business. I remember because Mother cried about him missing my wedding day." James studied the signature more carefully. Could he have signed it before he left? Given permission in advance? Clara shook her head. "No, the date is right there next to his name. June 15th, 1860. But I remember getting a telegram from him that morning, wishing me well from Chicago. He was definitely not in Pennsylvania." They stared at the page in stunned silence. Clara's marriage certificate contained a forged signature, which meant the whole ceremony might be legally worthless. But proving forgery would require more than just her word against Edmund's. "We need proof your father was in Chicago that day," James said. "Hotel records, business documents, something official." "The Morrison Shipping Company," Clara said suddenly. "Father owned part of a shipping business in Chicago. If he was there on business, there would be records, contracts, or bills of sale dated around my wedding." James checked his pocket watch. "The telegraph office opens in an hour. If we send a message now, we might get an answer by this afternoon." They hurried across town to the telegraph office, where Clara composed a careful message to the Morrison Shipping Company, asking for any business records from June 1860 involving her father. The clerk promised to send it immediately and watch for a reply. But as they left the telegraph office, Clara felt her heart sink. Even if they could prove her father was in Chicago, that didn't necessarily prove the signature was forged. Edmund's lawyer would argue that someone could have made an honest mistake about the date, or that Robert Morrison had given permission through a letter that was lost over time. It's not enough, she said aloud, voicing the fear that was growing in her chest. Even if we prove my father wasn't there, a judge might decide the marriage is still valid. 7 years of living as husband and wife, that has to count for something in the law. James stopped walking and turned to face her. Clara, listen to me. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're not the same woman who stepped off that train 3 months ago. You've found your strength, your voice, your worth. Edmund can't take that away from you, no matter what some judge decides. But he can take everything else, Clara replied. The ranch, this life, you. If I lose tomorrow, I go back to being his property, back to being invisible. Then we won't let you lose, a new voice said behind them. They turned to see Moira approaching with a determined expression and a leather satchel in her hands. I've been thinking about this all night, Moira continued, about marriage laws and what makes a wedding legal. And I remembered something my Patrick used to say about contracts. She opened the satchel and pulled out a thick book. Patrick studied law before he came west. This is his book on contract law, and it says something interesting about fraudulent documents. Clara took the book and read where Moira's finger pointed. A contract obtained through fraud or misrepresentation is void from the beginning, regardless of how long the parties acted as if it were valid. If Edmund knew the signature was forged, James said slowly, then he obtained the marriage through fraud. That would make it invalid from day one. But how do we prove Edmund knew? Clara asked. Moira smiled grimly. By proving he was the one who arranged the forgery. Think about it, Clara. Your father was out of town. Your mother was too sick to pay attention to details. Who else would have had access to examples of your father's signature? Who else would have benefited from rushing the ceremony through? The pieces began clicking together in Clara's mind. Edmund had been eager to marry quickly, before her father returned from his business trip. He had handled all the paperwork, saying it was too complicated for her to worry about. He had even chosen the minister and the witnesses. He needed my father's permission to make the marriage legal, Clara said, her voice growing stronger as she worked through the logic. But he also needed my father gone so he couldn't object to the match. So he forged the signature and hoped no one would ever check. That's a serious accusation, James warned. You'll need more than suspicion to convince a judge. Then we'd better find more, Clara replied, feeling a familiar fire building in her chest. The same fire that had driven her to demand a place in the cattle drive, that had given her the courage to stand up to Edmund on the ranch porch. She had one day left to prove her freedom was worth fighting for. One day to show that Clara McKenna was stronger than Clara Hartwell had ever dreamed of being. Let's go find the truth, she said, tucking the law book under her arm like a weapon. Edmund wants a fight, then by God, he's going to get one. The telegram arrived at sunset like a gift from heaven, and Clara's hands trembled as she tore open the yellow paper. The message from Chicago was brief but devastating. Robert Morrison, present, Chicago, June 10. 21,860 signed major grain contract June, 15 witnesses available stop Morrison Shipping Company. James let out a whoop of victory, but Clara felt her stomach drop as she realized what this meant. Her father had definitely been in Chicago on her wedding day, which proved beyond doubt that someone had forged his signature. But it also meant tomorrow's hearing would determine whether her entire adult life had been built on a lie. We need to find the minister who performed the ceremony, Clara said, pacing the telegraph office like a caged animal. Reverend Hamilton. If Edmund arranged the forgery, the minister might remember something suspicious about the paperwork. Hamilton died 2 years ago. The telegraph clerk offered helpfully, but his widow still lives in town. Martha Hamilton, nice lady, keeps all his old records in case people need copies of marriage certificates and such. Within an hour, they were sitting in Martha Hamilton's parlor, surrounded by china dolls and the smell of lavender sachets. The elderly widow served tea with shaking hands, while Clara explained why they needed to examine her late husband's records. Such a terrible business, Martha clucked sympathetically. A woman should be able to choose her own path in life. Let me fetch Harold's marriage book from 1860. She returned with a leather-bound ledger that looked identical to the one in the courthouse. But when she opened it to June 15th, Clara gasped. The entry showed her marriage to Edmund. But something was different. "Look at this," Clara said, pointing to the signature line. "In this book, it shows my father's signature as R. Morrison, just initials. But in the courthouse records, it's written out as Robert Morrison in full." Martha adjusted her spectacles and peered at the page. How odd. Harold was always so careful about matching signatures exactly. He said it was important for legal purposes. James leaned forward. "Mrs. Hamilton, do you remember anything unusual about this particular wedding? Anything that seemed rushed or strange?" The old woman was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the tea table as she searched her memory. "Now that you mention it, there was something. The young man, your husband, dear, he came to see Harold 3 days before the ceremony, said there had been a mistake in the paperwork, and he needed to correct it." Clara's heart began to race. What kind of mistake? "Something about your father's signature not being complete enough. The young man said he had a proper document with your father's full name signed, and he wanted Harold to update the church records to match." Harold thought it was strange, but the young man was so insistent. "Did my husband bring a document with my father's signature on it?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Martha nodded slowly. "A business letter, I think. He said your father had written giving permission for the marriage, and he wanted the church records to reflect the proper signature. Harold copied it exactly." The pieces fell into place like dominoes toppling. Edmund had brought a forged document to the church, claiming it was legitimate correspondence from her father. The minister had copied the fake signature into his records, and then Edmund had used that church record to create the fraudulent entry in the courthouse files. "Mrs. Hamilton," James said carefully, "do you still have that business letter? The one Edmund brought to your husband?" "Oh my, that was so long ago. Harold kept everything. But after he passed, I had to clean out his study." Martha's face brightened. "Wait, there might be something. He had a special box for unusual documents, things that seemed important but didn't fit in the regular files." She disappeared into the back of the house and returned 10 minutes later with a dusty wooden box. Inside were dozens of papers, odd contracts, questionable deeds, and correspondence that had raised red flags for the careful minister. Near the bottom of the box, Clara found what they were looking for: a single sheet of expensive paper with her father's business letterhead, dated 3 days before her wedding. The letter gave permission for her marriage to Edmund and was signed Robert Morrison in the same handwriting that appeared on the marriage certificate. But Clara had seen enough of her father's real correspondence to know this signature was wrong. The loops were too wide, the slant too steep. Someone had tried to copy her father's signature from memory and hadn't quite gotten it right. "This is it," she whispered, holding the paper like it was made of gold. "This proves Edmund forged the whole thing." James examined the letter more closely. "Look at the letterhead. It says Morrison Shipping, Philadelphia office, but your father was a partner in the Chicago office. He wouldn't have used Philadelphia letterhead for personal correspondence." Clara felt tears of relief and anger streaming down her face. After 7 years of being told she was worthless, she finally had proof that her marriage had been a fraud from the very beginning. Edmund had tricked her into a ceremony that had no legal standing, then spent years making her feel guilty for not being a good enough wife. "Will this be enough?" she asked James. "Will a judge believe this proves fraud?" With the telegram from Chicago and Mrs. Hamilton's testimony about how Edmund brought this letter to her husband, I think even Edmund's lawyer will have trouble explaining this away. But even as relief flooded through her, Clara felt a new kind of fear creeping in. Tomorrow's hearing would determine her legal status, but it wouldn't erase 7 years of emotional damage. Proving Edmund was a liar didn't automatically make her whole again. What if winning doesn't feel like I thought it would? She asked quietly as they walked back toward the ranch in the gathering darkness. What if proving he's wrong doesn't make me feel right? James stopped walking and turned to face her. Then we'll figure out what right feels like, one day at a time. You don't have to heal from 7 years of hurt overnight, Clara. You just have to be brave enough to start. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the vast Nebraska sky. Clara thought about the woman who had stepped off the train 3 months ago, broken and defeated. That woman could never have imagined standing here now. holding evidence that could set her free, surrounded by people who cared about her happiness rather than her usefulness. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with Edmund and his lies, but tonight, for the first time in years, Clara fell asleep, feeling hopeful about her future. The future she was finally brave enough to choose for herself. The courthouse filled with spectators like it was the 4th of July parade, and Clara realized half the territory had come to watch her fight for freedom. Judge Morrison sat behind his desk, looking like Moses preparing to hand down commandments, while Edmund's lawyer shuffled papers with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case. Edmund himself sat rigid in his chair, his face pale but determined. This morning he looked older than his 35 years, worn down by the weight of his own deception finally coming to light. But Clara could see the stubborn set of his jaw that she remembered from their worst arguments. He wasn't planning to surrender without a fight. This hearing will determine the legal status of the marriage between Edmund James Hartwell and Clara Elizabeth Morrison, Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "Mr. Blackwood, you may present your case." Edmund's lawyer stood with theatrical precision. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of a wife refusing to honor her legal obligations. Mrs. Hartwell has been seduced by frontier life and romantic notions, but the law is clear about a woman's duty to her husband." He produced the marriage certificate from the courthouse files, pointing to what appeared to be her father's signature. This document shows proper parental consent was given, making the marriage completely legal. My client seeks only to reclaim what is rightfully his. Clara felt her stomach twist as Blackwood painted her as a wayward wife who needed to be brought back under proper control. Several women in the courthouse shifted uncomfortably, and she realized many of them faced similar battles in their own marriages. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, the defendant has been living in an improper relationship with another man while still legally married. This behavior demonstrates a clear need for her husband's guidance and protection. Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Hartwell, do you have representation?" Clara stood up, her legs shaky but her voice clear. "I'll speak for myself, Your Honor. I have evidence that my marriage to Edmund Hartwell was obtained through fraud and forgery." A murmur ran through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hartwell. Present your evidence." Clara pulled out the telegram from Chicago first. "This proves my father was in Chicago on June 15th, 1860, my wedding day. He signed a major business contract that morning, witnessed by 3 people. He could not have been in Pennsylvania to give permission for my marriage." Blackwood jumped to his feet. "Objection. This telegram proves nothing about the signature on the marriage certificate. Mr. Morrison could have given written permission before leaving for Chicago." "That brings me to my second piece of evidence," Clara replied, producing the forged letter from Martha Hamilton's box. "This is the document Edmund brought to Reverend Hamilton 3 days before our wedding. He claimed it was correspondence from my father giving permission for the marriage." She held up the letter so the judge could see it clearly. "But look at the letterhead. It says Morrison Shipping, Philadelphia office. My father was a partner in the Chicago office only. He never worked in Philadelphia and wouldn't have used their letterhead for personal business." Judge Morrison examined the letter carefully while Blackwood whispered urgently with Edmund. Clara could see sweat beading on Edmund's forehead despite the cool morning air. "Furthermore," Clara continued, gaining confidence as she spoke, "Mrs. Martha Hamilton will testify that Edmund specifically asked Reverend Hamilton to change the church marriage records to match this document. He claimed there had been an error in the original paperwork." Martha Hamilton stood up in the gallery, her white hair gleaming in the morning sunlight. "That's exactly right, Your Honor. My late husband thought it was strange, but the young man was so insistent about correcting the signature." The courtroom buzzed with excitement as people began to understand what Clara was proving. Edmund had forged her father's permission, manipulated the church records, and then used those false documents to create a fraudulent marriage certificate. Blackwood tried one last desperate argument. "Even if there were irregularities in the paperwork, my client and Mrs. Hartwell lived as husband and wife for 7 years. Common law marriage would make their union legal, regardless of the original documents. But Judge Morrison was already shaking his head. Common law marriage requires mutual consent and agreement to be married. If Mrs. Hartwell was deceived about the legal status of her father's permission, then her consent was obtained through fraud. He turned to Edmund, who had been growing more pale with each piece of evidence. "Mr. Hartwell, do you have anything to say about these accusations?" Edmund stood slowly, his hands gripping the back of his chair. For a moment, Clara thought he might confess everything and throw himself on the court's mercy. Instead, his face hardened into the stubborn expression she knew so well. "I loved her," he said simply. "Her father would never have given permission because he thought I wasn't good enough for his daughter. I did what I had to do to marry the woman I wanted." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even Blackwood looked stunned that his client had just confessed to fraud in front of 50 witnesses. "And when she couldn't give you children?" Clara asked, finding her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "When I couldn't be the perfect wife you wanted? Was that love too?" Edmund's mask finally slipped completely. "You were supposed to be grateful. I gave you a home, security, everything a woman could want, but nothing was ever enough for you. What I wanted was to be seen as a person, not a possession," Clara replied. "What I wanted was a partner, not a master. What I wanted was love that didn't depend on me being perfect." Judge Morrison banged his gavel as the courtroom erupted in applause. "Order! Order in my court!" When silence returned, he looked directly at Clara. "Mrs. Morrison, and that is your legal name. Since your marriage was obtained through fraud, you are hereby declared a free woman. The marriage contract is null and void from its inception." Clara felt her knees buckle with relief. James caught her arm, steadying her as the reality of victory washed over her. She was free. Legally, completely, absolutely free. But Edmund wasn't finished. "This isn't over," he snarled as Blackwood packed up his papers in defeat. "I'll appeal this decision. I'll fight you in every court from here to Washington if I have to." "No," Clara said quietly, but her voice carried through the silent courtroom. "You won't, because I'm not worth that much effort to you, Edmund. I never was. Find someone else to control, someone else to blame for your disappointments. I'm done being your victim." As Edmund stormed out of the courthouse with his lawyer trailing behind, Clara felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she belonged to herself and no one else. The battle was over, but more importantly, she had finally won the war for her own soul. The wedding dress hung in Clara's small room like a ghost from someone else's life, cream-colored silk that had never been worn and probably never would be. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory, and James had been patient as prairie grass waiting for rain. But Clara couldn't bring herself to set a date for their own ceremony. "It's not that I don't love you," she told him as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It's just that the word marriage still tastes like poison in my mouth." James whittled a piece of wood with his knife, making slow, careful cuts that reminded Clara of how he approached everything, with deliberation and endless patience. "We don't have to call it marriage," he said without looking up from his carving. "We could call it partnership, or just making it official that we choose each other every day." The suggestion made Clara smile despite her fears. This was what she loved about James. He didn't try to force her into shapes that didn't fit. He found new shapes that worked for both of them. But even as she felt her heart warming to the idea, a commotion in the ranch yard drew their attention. A rider was approaching fast, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgent news. "James! Moira!" the man called as he pulled up near the porch. Clara recognized him as Tom Bradley, who ran the general store in Millbrook. "You need to hear this. Edmund Hartwell's back, and he's brought trouble with him." Clara felt ice form in her stomach, despite the warm evening air. "What kind of trouble?" Tom swung down from his horse, his face pale in the fading light. "He's got himself appointed as a federal marshal. Claims he's investigating fraud and corruption in local land deals. Says he has authority to seize property involved in illegal activities." James set down his carving, and Clara could see the soldier rising in him again, alert, calculating, ready for battle. What's that got to do with us? Everything, Tom replied grimly. He's claiming this ranch was bought with money from fraudulent cattle sales. Says he's got evidence that Moira's been selling stolen livestock to buyers in Kansas. The accusation was so ridiculous that Clara almost laughed. Moira Brennan was the most honest person she had ever met. Someone who would walk 5 miles to return a penny she found that didn't belong to her. But the law didn't care about character when presented with official documents and federal authority. Moira appeared in the doorway, having heard enough to understand the threat. Patrick always said Edmund Hartwell was the kind of man who would burn down the world if he couldn't rule it. Guess he was right. Can he really do this? Clara asked, her legal victory suddenly feeling fragile as morning frost. Can he use federal authority to come after us personally? Tom nodded reluctantly. Federal marshals have broad powers, especially when it comes to interstate crime. If he's got documents that look official, most local judges will defer to his authority rather than risk a fight with Washington. Clara felt the familiar fear trying to claw its way back into her chest, the old voice that whispered she was powerless against men like Edmund. But then she looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the people who had helped her discover her own strength, at the life she had built from nothing but determination and hope. How long do we have? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He's setting up in town tonight, Tom replied. Plans to ride out here tomorrow morning with papers to seize the property and arrest Moira for cattle theft. James stood up, his face grim as winter stone. Then we'd better be ready for him. But Clara was already thinking beyond tomorrow's confrontation. Edmund had made this personal, and personal battles required personal solutions. She had beaten him once by exposing the truth about their fraudulent marriage. Maybe she could beat him again by exposing the truth about his fraudulent authority. Tom, she said suddenly, when did Edmund get appointed as a federal marshal? Who signed the papers? Tom scratched his head. Come to think of it, that's a good question. He just showed up in town this afternoon with a badge and a stack of official-looking documents. Said he'd been tracking this case for months. Federal appointments take time, Clara mused, remembering conversations with her father about government bureaucracy. There are background checks, paperwork, approval processes. Edmund couldn't just decide to become a marshal overnight. James caught her meaning immediately. You think he's bluffing? Faking federal authority? I think Edmund Hartwell is a man who lies when the truth doesn't serve his purposes, Clara replied. And I think we need to find out exactly who appointed him and when, before he can destroy everything we've built here. Moira stepped forward, her gray eyes fierce as a hawk protecting its nest. What do you need from me? Clara felt a surge of affection for the older woman who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. I need you to trust me one more time. And I need you to be ready to prove that every cow on this ranch was bought and paid for legally. That's easy enough, Moira said. Patrick kept records of every transaction going back 15 years. Bills of sale, breeding records, everything. Good, Clara said, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's confrontation. Because I have a feeling Edmund's about to discover that lying to federal authorities is a much more serious crime than anything he's accusing us of. As Tom rode back to town with messages for the real authorities, Clara stood on the porch looking out over the prairie that had taught her what freedom felt like. Edmund thought he could use fear and false authority to drag her back into his control. He was about to learn that Clara Morrison was no longer afraid of bullies, even when they wore badges. The war wasn't over after all, but this time, she was ready for the fight. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Brennan ranch, and Clara stood at the kitchen window watching 3 riders approach through the morning mist. Edmund rode in front, a federal marshal's badge glinting on his chest, flanked by 2 men who looked like they had been hired more for muscle than legal expertise. Behind her, the kitchen buzzed with quiet activity. Moira packed important documents into a leather satchel, while James cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. They had spent the night preparing for this confrontation, but Clara knew the real battle would be fought with words rather than weapons. Remember, she said as the riders drew closer, let Edmund talk first. Let him show his hand before we play ours. The knock on the door came sharp and official, followed by Edmund's voice calling out with newfound authority. Federal Marshal Edmund Hartwell, open up for official business. Clara opened the door to find Edmund transformed. Gone was the desperate man who had fled the courthouse 6 months ago. In his place stood someone who wore power like an expensive coat, confident and cold, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. "Clara," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness, "you're looking well. Frontier life seems to agree with you." "Edmund," she replied evenly, "I hear you've found yourself a new career. How interesting that you became a federal marshal so quickly after losing your wife." His smile was sharp as a blade. The federal government values men of principle, men who understand the importance of law and order in these frontier territories. He pulled out a folded document and handed it to Clara with theatrical ceremony. "This is a warrant for the arrest of Moira Brennan on charges of cattle, theft, and fraud. It also authorizes the seizure of this property as evidence in federal crimes." Clara read the warrant carefully, noting the official-looking seals and signatures. To an untrained eye, it would appear completely legitimate. But her father had taught her to read legal documents, and she spotted several irregularities that made her heart race with hope. "This is quite impressive," she said, handing the warrant to James. "Tell me, Edmund, when exactly were you sworn in as a federal marshal?" 2 weeks ago, in Denver," Edmund replied smoothly. "Marshal Davidson administered the oath personally." "Marshal Davidson," Clara repeated thoughtfully. "Would that be the same Marshal Davidson who died in a riding accident 3 months ago? I read about it in the Denver newspaper." For just a moment, Edmund's confident mask slipped, but he recovered quickly, his lawyer's training taking over. "You must be thinking of someone else. Marshal Davidson is very much alive and in charge of federal law enforcement for this territory." "Perhaps," Clara said mildly. "I'm sure you won't mind if we send a telegram to Denver to confirm your appointment, just to satisfy our curiosity about federal procedures." "There's no time for that," one of Edmund's companions said, speaking for the first time. "We have authority to act immediately in cases of ongoing criminal activity." Clara studied the man who had spoken, thick-necked and brutal-looking, with the kind of scars that came from saloon fights rather than honorable service. Definitely hired muscle rather than legitimate law enforcement. "Of course," she said agreeably, "but I'm sure you understand our desire to be thorough. After all, impersonating a federal officer is a serious crime. The penalty is quite severe, I believe." Edmund's face was beginning to show strain around the edges. "Clara, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Mrs. Brennan is under arrest, and this property is seized pending investigation. You can either cooperate or be arrested as accessories." "Actually," James said quietly, "I think we'll wait for the real federal authorities to arrive." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the yard. But these weren't more of Edmund's hired men. Clara recognized the lead rider as Deputy Marshal Thompson, whom Tom Bradley had contacted the night before through official channels. Thompson dismounted with the easy confidence of someone who actually wore his badge legally. "Morning, folks. I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson out of Cheyenne. I understand there's some confusion about federal authority here." Edmund straightened, trying to maintain his commanding presence. "Marshal Thompson, I'm Federal Marshal Hartwell. I have jurisdiction in this matter." Thompson looked at Edmund with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with many frauds over the years. "Is that so? Well, Marshal Hartwell, perhaps you could show me your commission papers." "The official ones from the Territorial Governor's office." "I have them right here," Edmund began, reaching into his coat. But Clara could see his hands shaking slightly as he realized his bluff was being called by someone who knew the real procedures. "Actually," Thompson said, producing his own documents, "I have a telegram here from Marshal Davidson's replacement in Denver. Seems there's no record of anyone named Edmund Hartwell being appointed to federal law enforcement. In fact, there's a warrant out for someone matching your description who's been impersonating federal officers across 3 territories." The color drained from Edmund's face as his elaborate scheme collapsed around him. His hired men began backing toward their horses, clearly having no interest in facing real federal charges. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, "I have instructions to investigate claims that you've been using false federal authority to settle personal grievances." That's a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Clara watched Edmund's transformation from confident authority figure to cornered animal with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. This was the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life, reduced to a common criminal by his own desperate need to maintain power over others. "The warrant for Mrs. Brennan's arrest," Thompson said, extending his hand toward Edmund. "I'll need to examine that as well." With obvious reluctance, Edmund handed over the document. Thompson studied it for less than a minute before shaking his head. Forged federal seals, invalid signatures, completely fraudulent. "Mr. Hartwell, you're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer, fraud, and attempted theft of property under false pretenses." As Thompson placed handcuffs on Edmund's wrists, Clara felt the last chains of her past finally breaking away. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was just another criminal being led away to face justice. "Clara," Edmund called out as Thompson loaded him into the back of a wagon. "This isn't over. I'll find another way." "No," Clara replied firmly. "It is over. You don't get to control my life anymore, Edmund. You don't get to threaten my family or my home. You're done." As the wagon carrying Edmund disappeared down the road, Clara felt James's arm slip around her waist. Moira stood beside them, grinning like she had just watched the best show of her life. "Well," the older woman said, "I'd say that went better than expected. Nothing like watching a bully get what he deserves." Clara leaned into James's warmth and looked out over the prairie that had taught her what freedom meant. For the first time since stepping off that train 9 months ago, she felt completely, absolutely, permanently free. The future stretched ahead of them like an endless horizon, full of possibilities she was finally brave enough to embrace.